Ethan Andrews stared out the window of his father's grand office, overlooking the city his family had built from the ground up. He could see the towers gleaming in the distance, each one a symbol of the power and wealth that had been handed to him on a silver platter. But none of it mattered anymore. None of the privileges, the accolades, the promises of a future without struggle could fill the emptiness. Gnawing at him inside, he had failed. Every test life had thrown his way, and the weight of it felt like an iron anchor dragging him under. The emails stacked up in his inbox unread, the phone calls ignored, and the meetings with his father's partners, that should have been his chance to prove himself, now only served to remind him of how little he had to offer. At the ripe age of 20, Ethan had nothing to show for his life, nothing to show for all the resources he had been given, nothing except his failures, his inability to meet the expectations of a father who had never asked anything less than perfection of him. He had been to the finest schools, surrounded by tutors, surrounded by people who were paid to help him succeed, but no matter how hard he tried, the results never came, the grades never improved, the social situations never felt right, and the future he was supposed to inherit felt like a burden he could not carry. His phone buzzed on the desk, the screen lighting up with another message from his father. "Ethan, you missed another deadline. We need to talk tonight. Make it happen." Ethan threw his phone down in frustration. It had been like this for months, and the constant pressure was suffocating. It felt like the world was closing in on him, like everyone around him could see through the facade he had built, and it terrified him more than anything in the world. He stood up, pacing around the office, his mind racing with thoughts of failure and inadequacy. But there was no escape. There was no place where he could hide from it. All he thought back to the last conversation with his father when the words, "You're a disappointment," had left his lips. It stung more than it ever should have, because those words felt like the truth for the first time. The door to his office opened without a knock, and in walked Mr. Daniels, the school janitor, a man Ethan barely knew, but who had somehow found his way into the office that day. The man had never been invited, but he had this quiet way of just being there, always cleaning, always doing his job without fuss. Ethan couldn't help but feel irritated, the intrusion not helping his already foul mood. But Mr. Daniels was unfazed. He simply walked in, mop in hand, and began cleaning the floor, as though Ethan's frustration was irrelevant. He had always seemed like the kind of person who didn't let anything bother him, even the weight of this place. "What do you want, Daniels?" Ethan snapped, unable to contain his irritation. Daniels didn't flinch. He just kept mopping, his eyes on the floor, but his voice calm. "I've been watching you for a while, Ethan," he said, his tone oddly soft yet piercing. Ethan raised an eyebrow, confused by the statement, but he didn't respond, his mind still a whirlwind of emotions. "You're struggling," Mr. Daniels continued, still focused on the mop in his hand. "But it doesn't have to be like this." Ethan blinked, his frustration giving way to curiosity for the first time today. "What do you mean? What could you possibly know about it?" Mr. Daniels stopped for a moment, then slowly turned to face Ethan. The look in his eyes was calm, but filled with an odd kind of wisdom. "I see more than you think, Ethan," he said simply. "I see a young man who's been given everything, yet you still feel empty inside because you haven't learned the most important lesson of all." Ethan laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in the silence of the room. "And what's that?" "How to be perfect like everyone expects me to be." "I already know that." Daniels, "It's all I've ever been told I need to do." Mr. Daniels shook his head slowly. "No, Ethan, that's where you're wrong," he said, his voice dropping a little, as if trying to make Ethan hear the truth. "The lesson isn't about being perfect or doing everything right. It's about learning to fail and getting back up again." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The words didn't make sense, not at first, but there was something about them that struck him, something that felt strangely true, and it made him pause for a moment. "I'm not like you, Daniels," Ethan said, the words coming out almost defensively. "I don't get to fail. I don't have the luxury of failure. My family doesn't let me off the hook like that." Mr. Daniels met his gaze, his eyes filled with a calm understanding. "That's exactly why you're stuck," he said softly. "You've been taught that failure is something to avoid, something that makes you weak, but that's not true. Failure is part of the journey. It's how you grow, how you learn." Ethan stared at him, his mind swirling. The words felt like they were coming from someone who truly understood what it meant to be lost. But what could a janitor possibly know about success, about the weight of his family's expectations? "Look at me, Ethan," Mr. Daniels said, his voice steady and unwavering. "I've worked here for 20 years, and I've seen countless people come and go, some with everything handed to them, others who had nothing. But the one thing I've learned is that the ones who succeed are the ones who understand failure. They embrace it, they learn from it, and they never give up. Ethan felt a strange pull in his chest, the words resonating deep within him for the first time. He wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was truth in what the janitor was saying. Could it be possible that the thing he feared the most was actually the key to his success? "What's your secret then?" Ethan asked, his voice quieter than before. Mr. Daniels gave a small, knowing smile, and without another word, he handed Ethan a piece of paper. It was a simple piece of parchment, with a few handwritten words scrawled across it. "You'll figure it out," Mr. Daniels said, before turning back to his work, leaving Ethan standing there, holding the piece of paper. Wondering what had just happened, Ethan stared at the piece of paper in his hands, his fingers trembling slightly as he unfolded it. The handwriting was rough, uneven, but there was something about it that felt genuine, something that made him want to understand it more than anything else he had ever tried to understand in his life. It wasn't much, just a few words scribbled hastily, but in that moment, those words held the weight of the world. The paper read simply, "Failure is not a mark of weakness. It's a chance to learn." Ethan read it over and over again, as if somehow the more times he saw the words, the clearer they would become. But it didn't make sense. How could failure be a chance to learn? He had been taught all his life that failure was the enemy, that failure was something to avoid. At all costs, his father's voice echoed in his mind, "You're better than this. Ethan, you need to focus. You need to rise to the occasion." Every word his father ever spoke was about success, about winning, about being the best. But here was a janitor, someone who had nothing, telling him the exact opposite, and it confused Ethan more than anything had in a long time. He looked up from the paper and glanced around the office, his eyes scanning the opulence of the room, the leather chairs, the polished wood, the soft lighting. Everything around him screamed success, but it all felt hollow now. It all felt empty. The wealth, the status, the future that was meant to be his, all of it felt like a cage closing in on him instead of a gift. Ethan crumpled the paper in his fist, frustration bubbling up inside him. He couldn't let this go. He couldn't just take the janitor's words and suddenly change his entire way of thinking. It wasn't that simple. He had spent his whole life following a path that was carved out for him by his father, by society, by everyone who thought they knew what was best for him. But that nagging feeling in the back of his mind wouldn't go away. It wasn't just the janitor's words that had gotten to him. It was the way he had said them, the way he had stood there, so calm, so sure of himself, like he had figured out something the rest of the world had missed. And that made Ethan question everything he had ever believed about success and failure. That night, unable to sleep, Ethan found himself walking through the grand hallway of his family's mansion. He passed by the portraits of his ancestors, each one with their own story of triumph, of victory, of building an empire, but none of them had ever faced what he was facing now. None of them had ever had to fight against the weight of their own expectations, the expectations of a father who saw him as nothing more than a reflection of his own success. He stopped in front of the mirror in the hallway and looked at his reflection, really looked at it for the first time in a long time. What did he see staring back at him? Was he really the man everyone thought he was, the man his father expected him to be? Or was he just someone playing a part, pretending to be something he wasn't, pretending to have it all together when inside he felt more lost than he had ever been? He didn't know the answer, and that terrified him. He had always been able to rely on his family, on his name, on the idea that he was destined for greatness, but now it all felt like a lie, a mask he had worn for so long. He couldn't remember what it was like to just be himself, to be honest with himself. The next day, he went back to the school, the place where he had failed over and over again, the place that had become a constant reminder of how far he had fallen from his father's expectations. He couldn't get the janitor's words out of his head, couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something, that there was something important he was overlooking. His father, on the other hand, seemed more distant than ever. His calls, once frequent, now felt colder, more formal, like they were just going through the motions, like Ethan was nothing more than a responsibility to him, a task he had to manage. But Ethan didn't care as much as he once would have. The sting of his father's disappointment didn't hurt as badly when he knew he was starting to become the person he needed to be for himself, not for anyone else. One evening, as Ethan sat in his room, reviewing some financial reports from his father's company, a knock at the door startled him. He wasn't expecting anyone, especially not this late, and when he opened the door, He was surprised to see his mother standing there. Her face was a mask of calm, but her eyes gave away something else, something deeper, something that made Ethan's heart tighten. "Ethan, we need to talk," she said softly, her voice almost hesitant, as if she wasn't sure how to start. Ethan stepped aside to let her in, his mind racing at what this conversation could be about. His mother had always been the quieter one, the one who didn't push as hard as his father, but her words carried weight, and when she said they needed to talk, it meant something serious. She sat down on the edge of his bed, her eyes meeting his, full of emotion. She had never been the type to show vulnerability, but tonight, something was different. "I've been worried about you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know you've been struggling. I know you've been pulling away from us. But Ethan, I need you to understand something." Ethan looked at her, his heart pounding in his chest, unsure of what to say. He had tried so hard to hide his inner turmoil from her, tried so hard to be the son she wanted him to be, the son she had always hoped for. "I've watched you, Ethan," she continued, her eyes searching his face. "You've been fighting so hard to be perfect, to be everything your father wants you to be. But you've forgotten who you are in the process. You've been so focused on living up to his expectations, on trying to prove something to him, that you've lost sight of what really matters." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. He had heard these words before, but from his father they had never felt as sincere, as caring, as they did when his mother spoke them. It was the truth he had been avoiding, the truth he had known deep down but had never been willing to face. "You're not just a reflection of your father's dreams," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "You are your own person, Ethan, and I need you to start living for yourself. Not for him, not for anyone else." Tears welled up in his eyes as he listened to his mother's words. The weight of the truth hit him harder than he expected, but it also felt like a release. He had spent his entire life chasing after something that wasn't his to chase, living for someone else's vision of success, and in doing so, he had lost himself. His mother reached out and placed a hand on his, her touch warm and steady. "You've been running away from the truth, Ethan, but it's time to stop running. It's time to face it and let go of the burden you've been carrying." The truth, Ethan realized, wasn't just about his father's expectations. It wasn't just about trying to meet the demands of the world around him. The truth was about accepting that he was allowed to be imperfect, that he was allowed to fail, that he didn't have to carry the weight of everyone's dreams on his shoulders. He took a deep breath, the weight in his chest easing slightly. "I've been trying to be everything they want me to be, Mom," he admitted, his voice trembling. "I thought if I could just get it right, if I could just be the son they wanted, everything would fall into place. But it's like I'm always failing, always falling short, and I don't know how to fix it." His mother's expression softened, and she squeezed his hand gently. "You don't have to fix it, Ethan," she said. "You don't have to be perfect. You just need to be you." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, letting the truth of her words sink in. He had been so afraid of failure, so afraid of not being good enough, that he had never allowed himself to simply be human, to be flawed, to be real. And in that moment, he realized that he didn't need to fix everything. He didn't need to be perfect. He just needed to accept himself for who he was and let go of the expectations that had been weighing him down for so long. "I don't know who I am without all of this," Ethan whispered, his voice full of uncertainty. "Without the pressure, without the expectations. I don't know what I'm supposed to do." "You'll figure it out," his mother said softly. "One step at a time, one day at a time." Ethan nodded slowly, feeling a sense of clarity wash over him for the first time in a long time. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know exactly what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: he didn't have to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders anymore. The next day, Ethan found himself walking through the halls of his family's mansion. The walls that had always seemed so imposing now felt different. They felt more like part of his story, part of his past, and less like a burden he had to carry into his future. He didn't know what was coming next, but he knew he was ready to face it, to stop running, to stop hiding behind the walls of perfection, and to finally embrace the truth of who he was. As he walked past his father's office, he paused for a moment, knowing that this was the hardest step of all, but also the most important. He was ready to face his father, ready to let him see the real Ethan, flaws and all, because for the first time, Ethan was ready to stop pretending and start living for himself. The morning after his conversation with his mother, Ethan sat in the sprawling office of his father, feeling a nervous energy coursing through his veins. It wasn't that he was afraid of his father, or the confrontation that he knew was coming. It was the reality of what had been building up for months, for years, and now it was all coming to a head. Ethan's mind raced, the words he had rehearsed over and over in his head now seeming too fragile, too insignificant, to face the man who had built everything he had, and expected nothing less than perfection in return. His father's office, always so pristine and meticulously organized, felt more like a gilded cage than a place of success. Today the polished desk seemed like an obstacle, a reminder of everything Ethan had tried to avoid, everything that had led to his failure, everything that had shaped the weight in his chest every time he walked into a room that was supposed to be his one day. The door opened, and in walked his father, tall and imposing, his sharp suit and cold gaze making Ethan feel smaller than he ever had before. Without saying a word, his father sat down across from him, his fingers steepled in front of him, as if he was already preparing for the inevitable conversation that was about to take place. Seth back in his chair, his palms sweating slightly, but this time, he wasn't going to hide. He wasn't going to pretend that everything was fine, that he was the perfect son who could carry on the legacy he had been handed. Ethan had learned, perhaps for the first time in his life, that he didn't have to pretend anymore. Ethan. His father's voice was smooth, yet the sharp edge beneath it was undeniable. You've failed to live up to the expectations we set for you, and this is becoming a pattern. I've given you everything. I've made sure you have every opportunity to succeed, but you've squandered it, and it's starting to reflect poorly on the family name. Ethan swallowed hard, the familiar sting of his father's disappointment hitting him in the chest. But he didn't flinch, he didn't look away. Instead, he took a deep breath, and for the first time, he looked his father in the eye. I know I've failed you, and I've failed the family in so many ways, Ethan began, his voice steady but filled with the raw honesty he had never allowed himself to show before. But the truth is, I've been trying to be someone I'm not. I've been trying to live up to a version of success that isn't mine, and it's been destroying me inside. His father's eyes narrowed, a flash of disbelief passing over his face. What are you talking about? You're a part of this family. Ethan, you have everything anyone could ever want, everything I've worked my entire life for, and yet you're telling me you don't want it. Ethan shook his head slowly. It's not that I don't want it, he said quietly. It's that I don't know who I am without it, and I've been pretending for so long that I've lost myself in the process. There was a long silence, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt like he was no longer just trying to meet expectations. He was no longer hiding behind the walls of a persona he had built for himself. His father's gaze remained fixed on him, but Ethan didn't look away this time. He was finally ready to say what he had needed to say for so long. I'm not the perfect son you wanted me to be, Ethan continued, his voice stronger now. I've failed over and over again, and I've been afraid to admit that, to face that truth. But now I understand something I never did before. Failure isn't the end, it's just part of the journey, and I've spent so much time trying to avoid failure, trying to be what you wanted me to be, that I forgot what it means to be myself. His father's jaw clenched, and Ethan could see the anger rising in him. But there was something else there, to something that Ethan had never seen before, a flicker of uncertainty, of perhaps a realization that he had been so focused on shaping Ethan's future that he had neglected to see the person his son had become. You think this is easy for me? His father finally spoke, his voice sharp but tinged with something else now. You think I haven't sacrificed everything for this family, for you, and now you're telling me you don't want this life? Ethan shook his head slowly, feeling a deep sadness wash over him. It's not about not wanting it, Dad, he said quietly. It's about finding out who I am outside of this, outside of the empire you built. I've been living in your shadow for so long that I've lost myself. I don't know how to fix it, but I know I can't keep going down this path anymore, pretending to be something I'm not. There was a long pause, and Ethan could feel the weight of his father's gaze on him. Heavy and searching, his father opened his mouth to speak, but then stopped, as if weighing his next words, as if trying to process everything Ethan had just laid before him. Ethan held his breath, waiting for the inevitable anger, for the rejection, for the words that would confirm everything he had feared about the rift between them. But instead, his father spoke in a quiet, almost defeated tone. Maybe I've been too focused on the wrong things, his father said slowly, the edge of anger gone from his voice now. Maybe I've been so determined to make you into someone I thought you should be, that I forgot to let you be who you are. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, he wondered if he had heard his father correctly, the man who had always demanded perfection, who had always pushed him to be better, to be more, was now admitting that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong. Ethan didn't know what to say. He had expected a battle, a fight, something that would tear them apart. But what he had gotten was something far more unexpected. His father's words were the beginning of something new, something that could change everything between them. "I can't promise you that I understand what you're going through, Ethan," his father continued, his voice softer now, "but I will try. I've been so caught up in my own ideas of success that I forgot what matters the most, and maybe, just maybe, it's time to let you figure it out on your own." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat, and, for the first time in years, he found himself unable to hold back the tears. They weren't tears of sadness or frustration, but of relief, of a weight being lifted, of a moment of understanding between him and his father that had never existed before. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do next, Dad," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion, "but I know I can't do it alone." His father nodded slowly, and for the first time, Ethan saw something different in his eyes, something other than disappointment, something that looked like hope. "You won't be alone, Ethan," his father said softly. "We'll figure it out together." Ethan felt a wave of emotion wash over him, and for the first time, he believed it. He believed that maybe, just maybe, he could begin again, start over, and find the path that was truly his, not the one that had been laid out for him, not the one everyone expected, but his own path, one where he could finally be himself and not live in the shadow of someone else's dreams. As he stood up and left the office that day, Ethan realized that this was the beginning of something new, not just for him, but for his entire family. And though the road ahead was uncertain, he knew that whatever came next, he was no longer afraid to face it. The days that followed felt surreal to Ethan, as though everything he had known had been turned upside down. And inside out he woke up each morning not knowing what to expect, but with a renewed sense of purpose that had eluded him. For so long it wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but for the first time, he felt like he was finally on the path he was meant to walk. A path that had nothing to do with the expectations of his father or anyone else. It was his own. And the weight of that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. The first week after his conversation with his father was the hardest. Ethan had spent his entire life trying to avoid failure, trying to meet the demands of everyone around him. But now, he was letting go of all of that. He was learning to take risks, to make decisions without fear of failing, to trust that even when things went wrong, he could pick himself back up again and keep moving forward. There were moments when the old habits crept back, in moments when he felt the pressure building, when the familiar weight of his father's expectations would resurface, and he would begin to doubt himself. But each time that happened, he took a deep breath and reminded himself of the lesson he had learned from Mr. Daniels and his mother. Failure wasn't something to fear, it was something to learn from, to grow from, to use as a stepping stone on the way to becoming who he was meant to be. Ethan had started taking small steps toward his new life. He enrolled in a business course at a local college, something he had never considered before. His focus wasn't on the grades or the certificate, but on learning, on gaining knowledge that could help him make decisions based on what he understood, not just on what others told him to do. He spent late nights studying, not out of obligation, but out of a genuine desire to learn, to expand his mind beyond the narrow scope he had been living in for so long. It was in one of those late-night study sessions that Ethan received a message from his father, a simple text that read, "We need to talk." He had been waiting for this moment, knowing that eventually his father would want to discuss what had happened between them, but he wasn't sure what to expect, wasn't sure if the conversation would bring them closer or push them further apart. He called his father the next morning, his heart pounding as the phone rang, waiting for his father to pick up and set the tone of the conversation. The line clicked, and Ethan's father's voice came through, as calm and controlled as ever, but there was something different in it, something softer, something that made Ethan feel like maybe, just maybe, there was hope for them after all. "Ethan," his father said, his voice steady, "I've been thinking a lot about what we talked about, and I think it's time we discuss the future, not just your future, but the future of the company and your role in it." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat, unsure of what his father meant by that, but he knew that this conversation could be the moment that determined whether he was truly free to pursue his own path, or if he was going to be forced back into the mold his father had set for him. "I'm ready to listen," Ethan said, his voice steady, his heart racing. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and when his father finally spoke, his voice was different, not as commanding as it had been before, but filled with a hint of vulnerability. "I've been so focused on making you into someone I thought you should be, that I forgot to see the person you are, Ethan, and I think that's where I went wrong." Ethan's breath caught in his chest, and he couldn't help but feel a surge of emotion at his father's words. He had never heard his father speak like this, had never seen this side of him before, and it filled him with a mix of relief and fear. "I don't know if I'm ready to let go of the company just yet," his father continued, "but I want you to know that I see you now. I see the person you've become, and I'm willing to give you the space to find your own way. I'll be here to support you. But this time, it's on your terms, not mine." Ethan sat in stunned silence for a moment, processing the words that had just come from his father's mouth. For so long, he had feared that his father would never accept him for who he was, that he would never let go of the idea that Ethan had to live up to his image of success. But now, it seemed like his father was willing to let him go, to let him find his own way. "Thank you, Dad," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what the future holds, but I promise I'll do my best to find my own path, to build something that's mine, not just something I inherited from you." His father's voice softened, and there was a hint of pride in it as he spoke. "I know you will, Ethan. I'm proud of you, son." As the conversation ended, Ethan sat back in his chair, his heart heavy but filled with a strange sense of peace. It wasn't the answer he had expected, but it was the answer he needed. It was the freedom to be himself, to build something of his own, to create a life that was authentic and true to who he really was. The days that followed were filled with small victories, moments of clarity and self-discovery that Ethan had never experienced before. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew he was on the right path, and with each step he took, he felt more and more like the person he was always meant to be. A month later, Ethan stood in front of a small group of investors, presenting a new business idea he had been working on for weeks. It wasn't perfect. There were still plenty of risks, but for the first time, Ethan wasn't afraid of failure. He wasn't afraid of what might happen if things didn't go according to plan. Instead, he was focused on the process, on the lessons he could learn, and on the possibility of creating something meaningful. The investors listened carefully, some nodding in approval, others scribbling notes, but through it all, Ethan remained calm, his confidence rooted not in the desire for success, but in the understanding that failure was part of the journey, not the end of it. When the meeting was over, one of the investors approached him, a smile on his face. "I have to say, Ethan, I'm impressed. You've come a long way since our last meeting. I think you're onto something here." Ethan smiled, the weight of the old world finally lifting off his shoulders for the first time. He felt like he was truly walking his own path, and no matter what came next, he was ready to face it. As he walked out of the building that day, Ethan looked up at the sky, feeling a sense of freedom he had never known before. He wasn't living for anyone else anymore. He wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. He was finally living for himself, and that was the most powerful thing he had ever done. And as the sun set on that day, Ethan knew that this was just the beginning of his journey, a journey that would be filled with both triumphs and failures, but one where he would never stop learning, growing, and most importantly, being true to himself. The end.